Today, we are going back to our regularly scheduled content. I mean, not that it wasn't regularly scheduled before, but we're going back to a proper script with, actual research. So let's do this. Hello there, I'm Simon. Welcome to my channel. It feels like it's been a couple of centuries since I last talked about the history of Belgium. So let's continue our journey at last. When last we left our Belgian ancestors, feudalism had led to the rise of a political landscape that is starting to resemble modern Belgium, remotely. It still had a long way to go. The County of Flanders and the Duchy of Brabant were born, and we're in the middle of the 12th century Renaissance. Outside of the Belgian area, a conflict was starting to brew between, on one side, the Capetingians, descendants of Charlemagne, and at that point the royal house of France, and on the other side the Plantagenets, descendants of William of Normandy, and rulers of England. I'm not gonna go into it now, but if you're interested, ask your local history teacher. The point is that at this point, the Belgian lands were still technically part of France. Now, this new world that evolved in the past couple of centuries, with the cities and trade and the intellectual renaissance and all, was starting to get a little too big to just let it be. What I mean is that these new elements, or the new forms these elements were taking, were getting deeply established in the world, and people began realizing how much influence they actually had, which led to the founding of universities, guilds, and administrative institutions, like something that I believe in English is called the Alderman's Bank, which was a collection of civil servants who did the running of the city. So those institutions were created to get some order and control in these new elements. And it's important to note that this was done not only by the worldly authority, like kings and nobles, and also people like the artisans and traders, but it was also done by the religious authorities. Most, if not all, of the first universities were founded by Catholics to train their theologians so they could get access to influential positions at the courts of kings, and also to defend their dogmas against heretics. And that led to the prosecution of the people who were not Catholics, like the Jews, the Cathars, and the people in the Holy Land. Now, I'm not sure it would be entirely scientific of me to say that they did all that in order to gain more power and influence for the church, but there is no denying that it did help. Eventually, either because the church played the political game very well, or because they were very lucky with how everything transpired, probably a little bit of both. But eventually, the church became one of the main players on the political chessboard of medieval Europe. Surprisingly, this evolution, where the church became more invested in worldly affairs, led to a lot of people being unhappy with the institution. They said the church had forgotten what was important, and to make a long story short, they founded a bunch of new monastic orders, meant to revive the simplicity and poverty that had been inherent in the lives of Christ and his disciples, and that they believed was supposed to be a core principle of the church, which it wasn't anymore. So these new orders went around with no personal properties, preaching and begging for food. And one of the most popular of these orders was the Beguines. They were an order of laywomen who wanted to devote their life to God, without actually joining a convent. Their male counterparts were called the Beggards, by the way, but everyone always forgets that they existed. Anyway, these Beguines lived together in these neighborhoods called Beguinages. Now, trade also flourished in this period. The growing cities promoted trade, and traders and artisans alike united in dedicated guilds, which would regulate their work and protect their rights. Kinda like proto-unions. Bruges became one of the most important trade cities in all of Europe. Well, before the sand at the Zwin, the mouth of the route that connects Bruges to the sea rose too high to let ships through. Anyway, essential for trade was being able to transfer money safely over long distances. And that's where bankers come in. The idea was that one would give money to a banker in one place and they would give you a letter in return, detailing who has given how much money to who, and asking the reader of said letter to return that exact amount to the traveler upon their arrival at the destination. So then the traveler could hand that letter to a friend of the banker in the city of destination and get their money back, without actually having to carry it along and risk having it stolen. Unsurprisingly, the favorite example of this for everyone in Belgium is the Verbruggen family, who ran a series of taverns in Bruges. So that's what Belgium was like at the beginning of the 14th century. Which brings me to one of the most legendary parts of Flemish history. 1302, the Battle of Kortrijk. It's the most famous battle in the history of Flanders. But what the blazes actually happened there? Well, as I said, France and England were developing an almost constant conflict. And around that time, that was reaching another boiling point. The problem was that Flanders was technically part of France through feudalism, but economically it was actually more dependent on England. So when they were going to fight again, Flanders chose the side of the English. To make matters worse, the Count of Flanders, Guy of Dampierre, decided to marry off his daughter Philippa to Prince Edward II of England, and then kinda just cancelled his subscription to France. But that meant Flanders went back to the French king, because that's how feudalism works. So the king invaded and conquered a bunch of cities, and technically he had every right to do that, because he already owned those lands. In 1300 a ceasefire was achieved, which meant that the French still owned Flanders. But now Guy and a couple of other people were imprisoned, and we got a French regent called Jacques de Châtillon. And that's the end of that. But not for long, because apparently people like polarization. And so the population divided themselves into the Liliards on one side, which is mostly patricians who like the French, and the Clowards on the other side, which is mostly plebeians who didn't quite like the French as much. And both of these groups were Flemish people, who were technically also French. Like, this was not an ethnic issue, this is an economic one. Anyway, this led to rebellion in Bruges, led by these two guys. And then another one in Ghent. And then the rebellion started to grow and spread across Flanders. Of course, the king didn't like that and decided to send an army against them. Eventually, the son and grandson of Guy joined the rebels, and the two armies ended up meeting in Kortrijk. Against all odds, the rebels actually won that battle. Thing is, they won the battle, not the war. It wasn't over yet, and the war actually went on until the French king launched a full military and diplomatic assault on the Flemish, with the help of his new ally, Edward I of England. Right. Anyway, in 1305 there was a peace, and Robrecht de Bethune, who was actually also related to Guy of Dampierre, became the new Count of Flanders. And after Rob, the line of succession actually went fairly straight through his descendants for a while. Now, before all that, the population had actually been growing a bunch, and luckily the harvest was able to keep up. That is, until about 1313, when there were a couple of years where the harvest kinda totally failed, which meant that people began to starve, and they went underfed for years. To make things worse, around 1350 the Black Death arrived, which ended up killing about a third of everyone in Europe. And because starvation and a pandemic weren't bad enough, the monarchs decided they also needed a war that could last for a century. I've already mentioned that France and England had an armed relationship, and in 1337 that turned into a proper war. It's called the 100-Year War. I'm not going into it here. Look it up if you're interested. Now, through a series of smart marriages, because love was a political tool back then, one of Robrecht's descendants had gathered a rather big dominion, consisting of most of the area of current Flanders and more. The descendant in question being Margaret, the daughter of the Count of Flanders. She married the youngest son of the new King of France, Philip the Bold, who also happened to be the Duke of Burgundy. And that meant the start of the Burgundian dynasty. But that's a story for another day. Time for the YouTube thing. You know the drill, peeps. Everything you can do to help the channel is written right here on this pretty end screen. I love that end screen. It makes things so easy. If you want inspiration for things to comment, have you ever been to Belgium? Ever been to Bruges? It's an awesome city. I really recommend it. Anyway, if you made it this far, thank you. Join us again next week, because I'll be talking about what might actually be my new favorite film. But that'll do for today. Thanks for watching.